Okay, so I misspoke a little bit earlier. I think I said that there were only 5 videos. There are 6, but I think as you've noticed, they are shorter than what we were doing in the earlier part of the semester, because I know y'all are doing a lot of good work on your paper, and I want to give you time to do that. Um, I do want to talk a little bit now about how you convey emotions and perceive emotions in others. And I think that probably when you think about emotional perception, it's easy to think that overwhelmingly the dominant way we do it is through facial expressions. And I think there's a lot of truth to that, but not entirely. You might be surprised actually once we get to the end of the section. But when it comes to facial expressions, I'm sure a lot of you have heard about this idea about how there are universal human expressions that all humans make to convey emotions. So for example, if you take a neutral face, and then you ask, like, what does the average sad face look like? It's something like this. The average frightened face, anger, happiness, surprise, and disgust. Okay, it's thought that these are like the 6 basic human facial expressions and human emotions. There actually is a 7th that has been suggested. I always love to say this. I always love it when I can bring this up in person, because then I can always ask people what the 7th suggestion has been. What emotion might it be? Because it's not any of those obvious 6 ones. It turns out it's actually contempt or disdain, as it's referred to. So this is one guy making all these faces. There's him with contempt. This woman over here, she's got some contempt, and so on and so forth. Now, I said kind of like off the cuff that it is a human universality. It's thought that it's a universal mode of communication and emotions. So the question, though, you might be wondering is like, well, hi, Professor Cohen, how can you test if it's truly a human universal truth? And the way that this actually got initially going, and several decades ago, the main researchers think this, is that what they did is actually they didn't just go to other countries like Japan or Egypt or France and the United States and so on and so forth. They actually went to one place in particular, which is Papua New Guinea. And the reason they went to Papua New Guinea is because back then they had no television, they had no magazines, they had no natural connection to the Western world during this period of time in the late 60s or early 70s. So this was a group of people who effectively were as removed from Western culture as they could be. American, Japanese culture, even in the 60s and 70s, there was a lot of overlap: music, movies, magazines, and so forth. In Papua New Guinea, this was not the case. But it turned out that actually, even in these cultures, you would still find very similar facial expressions to correspond to the different basic 6 emotions. And so it's been argued that there are, in fact, these universal human emotions. There's a lot of ideas that people have about, like, why do we make these emotions? So for example, if you look down at me for 1 second, one idea is that when you're frightened and you make your face bigger, what do? You're opening your eyes, you're opening your nostrils, you're taking in more information. You're trying to make sure that everything that's out in the world that might be important gets processed by your senses so that you can make a decision about what to do and how to escape and so forth. What's the other one? Oh yeah, disgust. When we're disgusted, we make this facial expression. We close off our eyes, we close off our nose, we close off our mouth, because we're trying to limit now the type of input that is able to come into the system if we smell something, see something, taste something really foul. So there's a lot of theories actually as to why it's these gestures that we make to convey those emotions, and it's thought that those are the types of reasons that make them universal. Of course, it's very controversial. A lot of people, argue about, really, is it these different dimensions, but whatever. Because to me, the most powerful data comes from asking this question. If you imagine one of these people who are skeptical that it isn't and is not convinced by this, what could be an even more strict test of universality? Okay, how could you really test to see if all humans are going to experience or not experience, are going to convey and express these emotions in the same way? Turns out that it's thought that the strictest test you could do is with blind people. Why blind people? Because people who are born blind, they never really see other people communicating their emotions that way. And yeah, I mean, you could imagine that they might touch someone else's face, but if you talk to blind people, they're like, that's kind of a myth. If I was a blind person, I'd be like, yeah, we don't actually touch each other's faces as much as you seem to think that we do. That's kind of a sighted person myth. Like, when your friend is crying, you don't go up and touch their face. When your friend is like talking to you with some contempt in their voice, you don't go up and touch their face. That would be kind of weird. I'm blind, but I'm not gonna, break social norms like that. So what they've done is they've actually done a lot of analyses to look at individuals who have been born blind. And again, you can find that the sorts of facial expressions they make convey emotions that can be very easily classified. So much so that sometimes looking at the facial expressions of a blind individual and a sighted individual, it's easy to tell what expression, what emotion they're conveying. It's hard to tell which one of them is blind. So for example, here are two individuals, I think they're both athletes. One is blind, one is sighted. So I think one has just lost something in the Olympics, and one has lost something in the Special Olympics or some athletic contest like that. And take a look at them and try to determine, you can easily tell what they're feeling and what they're trying to convey, but it's hard to tell that this one on the left is the blind person and this one on the right is the sighted person, okay? Now, this is kind of why I wanted to bring this up, is that it's natural to wonder what's another way to convey emotions besides facial expressions. And I bet a lot of you have this thought already, which is that you could do it from body language. And so what you can do is you can, again, look at blind individuals and sighted individuals and see how their body language changes as a function of winning an athletic contest or losing an athletic contest. And so what you do is you actually take all these very specific body gestures, tilting the head back, arms raised, making fists, like slumping your shoulders and so on and so forth. And you get people to kind of just quantify how often do you see these particular behaviors. And so what we can do is we can look at these two patterns of behavior, okay? This is one individual and one group of people, and one other individual, another group of people, okay? And in this situation, one of them is the data corresponding to blind individuals, and one of them is corresponding to sighted individuals. And if I were to ask you to look at this data and be like, hey, is this the pattern of data for a blind person or a sighted person, or this one down here? You can't really easily tell the difference, because you're like, well, in both cases, both groups, they slump their shoulders more when they lose. In both cases, they smile and they raise their arms when they win. So it's really hard to tell the difference between them. It turns out that up here, these are the sighted athletes, and down here, these are the congenitally blind athletes. But by and large, their behavioral, their body language is pretty much exactly the same, again, for people who are born blind. One difference is the head tilting back. I'm not exactly sure why. I'm sure there's some theory, but apparently when blind people win, they don't tilt their head back in that same way that when sighted people do. So it's thought actually that body language may also be a universal or innate way, but it's way less studied than faces. Facial expressions have definitely been studied far more than body language. Okay, so here's the last thing that I want to point out, and then we'll move on to the last section, which is about the interaction between body language and facial expressions, okay? Because it's very easy to think that facial expressions are going to be the dominant way of communication, right? Well, here, look at these two bodies here. One of them just lost the point, and one of them just won the point in tennis, okay? Which one is which, okay? And so what you can do is you can then not only isolate their bodies to try to get people to tell what expression they're making from the body language, you can then kind of blank out their faces, and you can also separate faces from the bodies, and so you can make these judgments. And then this is my favorite part of the study, you can mix and match. So you could put this face on this body, you can put that same face on a different body, this face on this body, the same face on a different body, okay? So this is Maria Sharapova pumping her fist. This is Maria Sharapova seemingly, looking at her tennis racket frustrated. What you can do is you can ask, if a participant looks at these different types of, composite images, how are they going to rate the person's emotions overall? So in this situation, are we going to make a judgment based on what Maria Sharapova is doing with her body, or what she's doing with her face, and so on and so forth? So this is basically looking at how does body context affect how we see facial expression, okay? So in this situation, the y-axis is judging the facial expressions of the faces, okay? So we're basically trying to make a judgment of, what is Maria Sharapova's face telling us here? Look at her face, what is she doing? Look at her face, what is she feeling? His face, and so on and so forth. So we're actually just asking people about the faces here, but what we're going to be able to see is how the body language is sort of influencing those judgments. So in this case, we have a face where the person loses on the body of a person who loses. Oh gosh. Oh, sorry, hold on one second, my animation didn't work. All right, let's try that again. So now what we're going to look at, again, like I said, the face of a person who lost on the body of a person who lost. And as you'd expect, they're saying like it's a negative valence, the person's unhappy. The face of a person who won, and the body of a person who won. Okay, again, now it's positive, so this makes sense. But these are the interesting situations now, because these are now when you're going to have a discrepancy. So now what's going to happen? Is the data going to matter more about what the faces are doing or what the bodies are doing? Because the faces and the bodies are saying opposite things. Here's what ends up happening. When it's a face that's losing, but on a body that's winning, we interpret that face as a positive sign. When it's a face that's winning, but it's a body that's losing, we interpret that face as a body, as a losing face. So it actually turns out that body language seems like it's playing a really significant way in which we communicate our internal emotions. Not only is it doing that, it seems as in these situations where there's a tension, we actually might even use the body to kind of interpret. It's like the lens and the filter through which we will try to make sense of the facial expression that we're actually seeing. So it might not only just be a significant way we communicate our internal emotions, it might be almost even more like the more dominant of the two. Even though intuitively, I think it's very easy to think that the facial expressions are the more dominant one that we would rely on. Okay, so let's take one last break. And then when we come back, we're going to talk about one more emotional process. And then we'll call that a day.